some great responses to some of the things that we heard from the governor or Representative White, as well as some other information. And we're appreciative of the panel that's here and willing to provide their insights and their feedback and information on what we've heard and what we think may be coming. Our first speaker from the panel is going to be John. John, tell me your name. Salavarakis. John also warned me, you can see sitting next to Chris Gamboulis, many of you know Chris. John warned me that we probably were not wise in putting 2 Greeks on the panel at the same time, because there would probably be an outbreak of an argument at high volume at some point between the two of them. But that may happen. I've seen arguments with everybody on the panel, so that may not be an exclusive deal. But John is with Utah Foundation. They have recently done some research on with regard to local officials' feelings about some of these measures that are being talked about. And he's got some data, some information. He's going to present that to us, and we'll hear that first. Following that, then we'll proceed down the line here with the panelists, who will give us their insights and their feelings and information on some of this. We'll go with, right after John, we'll go to Chris Gamboulis with Ivory Homes, Ivory Development, which is the arm of Ivory that buys property and develops it so that they can then build those homes on them. And Chris has been doing that for a long time. I have known Chris for a lot of years. I knew Chris when he was working for the state, if you can believe that Chris actually was a government employee at one time. He worked in the State Economic Development Office. Following Chris, we'll hear from Cameron Deal, Executive Director of the League of Cities and Towns, who many of us know and we've heard from already sometimes, but we'll hear from Cam. And then we'll hear from Alyssa. Alyssa, tell me your last. Staley, thank you. With the, Salt Lake or Utah? Utah Association of Realtors. And she will give us, of course, their insights and feelings on what is happening. And then, following that, we will then open it up again for questions. We really encourage you to get involved here. Discuss, state some of your opinions and ideas, and ask questions of the panelists here. And we think that we can have some really interesting feedback on what goes on. So with that, John.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for stealing my joke, which leaves me nothing witty to say to start my presentation. It's all right. My name is John Salavarakis. I'm from the Utah Foundation. We conducted this survey early summer. We surveyed 85 communities, 600 municipal officials, and municipal employees regarding their perception of affordable housing and policies used to facilitate it. The definition of affordable housing was something that surprisingly came into focus as we surveyed the results. They understood it very differently, municipal officials and employees. They understood it to mean low quality, dense, as well as technical definitions based on area median income. Obviously, the first two probably more accurately reflect the perceptions of citizens within these municipalities. Municipal officials do see the need for affordable housing, however. They should see a shortage of diverse housing options. Municipal officials also appreciate the need for accessory dwelling units to the tune of 71%. They also recognize the need for streamlined permitting to the tune of 48%, and the welcome zoning for smaller lots and smaller homes to the tune of 57%. Here's where things get a little controversial. The moderate income housing plan was often opposed in open-ended survey responses, perceived as relatively heavy-handed and sometimes ill-suited to less urban municipalities. The 26 state-prescribed policy options are obviously less acceptable to respondents coming from rural communities and areas that are already built out. We also asked municipal officials where they got their information, how they're informed. Outside research informs most municipal officials' preferences, about 75% regarding housing policy. And most municipal officials also get their information from training events and colleagues about 75% each. We also asked about the source of opposition to affordable housing in their communities. Perhaps not surprisingly, the strongest barrier came from the communities themselves, about 54% as perceived by survey respondents. Opposition less commonly came from elected officials, 10%, and less common still, opposition from municipal staff, 3%. We asked about the costs and benefits of affordable housing. Responses centered on effective communication, both to communities so that a more informed dialogue can result, with the costs being stressed infrastructure, changing neighborhood character, socioeconomic integration, or blocked views. The benefits were perceived as better neighborhood character, possibly, more socioeconomic integration, lower aggregate housing costs, ecological friendliness, preservation of open space. We also asked about communication, and we discussed quite often in the office, actually, the degree to which municipalities are not historically great at communicating why we need affordable housing. We focus on, okay, we need density, we need height, we need affordability, but that's not nearly as persuasive as statements like the people who work in your community, including teachers, firefighters, and police officers, should have access to housing that they can afford in those communities. More nuanced and complex statements are probably more persuasive than the basic statement that we need density. More housing, especially lower cost types of housing, alleviate Utah's housing shortage and limit rents. This is also something that would be more persuasive, and there's a whole body of literature on this sort of thing. And sharing growth across communities by adding housing options with well-planned transportation can keep housing costs down, reduce how much time we spend in a car, improve air quality. These things are all interrelated in ways that the general public probably doesn't think about and would probably benefit from hearing from municipalities. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Are you going to set the timer? We're setting on each other, by the way, not just for me, for 5 minutes. Okay, go. So thank you for the invitation to be here. It's an interesting conversation, and I started getting involved in these discussions around land use and LUDMA in 2004. And Jody Hoffman, who just walked in, not late at all, was convening a bunch of meetings at the League of Cities and Towns with then Senator Greg Bell to recodify a lot of the court cases and change the language around LUDMA. That was in 2004. That bill passed in 2005, and then in 2006, we formed the Property Rights Coalition. We wanted to continue the conversation around land use and formed an official group. And so for literally 20 years, thanks to Jody and Wilf and others that convened back then, we had been having these conversations. And for the longest time, literally 2 decades, I've been saying people don't oppose growth and they don't oppose development. And I'm going to make an argument today that this is really, all these conversations are not about development. They're about housing and the bias in elected officials and municipal offices against housing and housing developers. And I'm going to tell you that I've been doing this for 31 years at Ivory Homes. So Utah's #1 home builder, more homes for 31 years than anyone else. So that means more lots, more development than anyone else. And I have been in hundreds of planning commission city council meetings. My team, I have a team now of 12 people that actually do the work. And there is not a bias against retail and industrial commercial development. I would argue that there would never be a building official that would bounce a building permit for a Costco for an incomplete development, when regularly single-family building, and I'm not even talking about affordable, I'm just talking about housing permits, that regularly single-family building permits that are complete are bounced for being incomplete or inaccurate, and that happens regularly. We see, even in our company, so we have one person that tracks building permits, where cities will do a building, they'll review the building permit, it'll be done in 6 days, and they'll get the notice that on the 14th day, because they can hold it. And so what we're going to start pushing for now in the future is around the parity of those permits and those applications, those rezone applications. And you heard the governor this morning, if you were here, he said, he brought up, he said he was going to kick the hornet's nest, and he said, maybe we should rethink the distribution of sales tax revenue. Let's make it population-based. And then would we have a housing crisis? I don't think we would. So Will mentioned that I started working for the state. I did, it was 1986, so it's a long time ago, in economic development. And economic development in 1986 and 1987 was a huge factor in Utah. There was a net out migration of 25,000 people in those years, each of those years, out of the state. And the population was under 2 million people. So if there was a net out migration today of 25,000 people, it would be impactful for our state. People would be worried about it today. Imagine how that felt when the population was like 1.7 million people. It was a huge problem. And it's taken all these years, these decades, to get Utah into a place where our economy is just humming. We are the envy of the country. But for some reason, we can't produce enough housing. And a lot of it has to do with the constraint of applications, land use applications and building permit applications, where we're having to put deadlines on those now, right? Oh, I'm at 5 minutes. I could finish my thought, because I'm not going to give you extra time. So we're putting deadlines on those, but we're not putting deadlines. We don't have to put deadlines on Costco's, do we?
Thank you, Chris, and I'll wait for you to set the timer so I don't get extra time. Chris and I were joking as we were preparing for this presentation that give either of us a microphone on this topic and we could talk all day, and so that's why we jokingly agreed to limit ourselves. But I have the great privilege of representing 1,400 mayors and council members across the state, from small towns to big cities. And one constant as I talk to mayors and council members and their staff, the one constant is that growth pressure that they're facing. Because growth doesn't just happen in a vacuum. Growth impacts quality of life. And you heard Governor Cox earlier, and I really appreciate his framing, that growth is neither a good thing nor a bad thing, it's just a thing. And it's how we plan for it that impacts quality of life. And you can't say to residents that your quality of life is great when they are sitting in traffic on I-15 in a way that they didn't 20 years ago. You can't just message your way around those inconveniences. Now, when we think about growth, Chris, I think it is important to think back to what Utah looked like in the late 1980s. And I say this as a sports fan, like in the late 1980s, Utah and BYU was good in football. They're good again now, unfortunately. But Utah was lousy in football in the 1980s, and never in a million years would we have thought Utah and BYU would be at the levels they are now. The Jazz hadn't made it to the NBA Finals, hadn't even made it to the Western Conference Finals, but once, and the franchise was struggling, and now the arena is both for the NBA and the NHL. And so you think about the amenities that growth has brought to the state. Utah is a much better place to live today, I would argue, than it was in 1986 because of those amenities. You can get much better Greek food now than you could in 1986. Like those are great things that have come from growth, but also what comes from growth are those challenges around planning and infrastructure and everything else. And that looks a little different if you're the mayor of a medium-sized suburb in Davis County than if you're the mayor of the largest city in the state, the capital city in Salt Lake, or if you're the mayor of Springdale or Moab and you're a gateway community that has been discovered and we can't go back. Utah's been discovered and we can't go back. And so part of the reason that local control, that term local control matters, I personally don't even like that term, but just I use it for air quotes so we know what we're talking about. The part of the reason that local control matters is because those mayors and council members are the ones who are ultimately responsible for the quality of life of their residents. And that includes planning for a variety of housing types. But it also includes making sure that we have the infrastructure and the public services in place in perpetuity for those housing units and for those businesses and everything else that the city is responsible for. So I'm quite proud of some of the accomplishments that we've had to date in the last few years. And I referenced, and Wolf referenced, that we've seen litigation in other states. Let me give you an example of where we don't have litigation because of the good work we've been able to do together. Several references have occurred over the last couple of days about the Land Use Task Force, and the three of us were in that meeting yesterday and have been doing those meetings for 20 some odd years, and kudos to Jody and Gary Crane and others who helped get that started way back when, and we've continued it. But let me give you one example where I think we found the right balance of state government, local government, the private sector, property owners, and how we're planning for growth and seeking to ensure quality of life. And that is how we are planning around transit stops. The governor mentioned this a moment ago, but I want to clarify something about how he framed it. He referred to it as a preemption. I don't think what we've done in Utah around transit stops is a preemption. Other states have done preemption where they've taken away the responsibility of cities and towns and counties, or they've dictated, thou shalt do it this way. And that's not what we've done here. So several years ago, then Representative Steve Waldrop, who's now the governor's housing advisor, ran House Bill 462 that did require cities to do enhanced planning near transit. That should be a no-brainer, right? We should think like, yes, we want to maximize the impact of the land use around those transit stops. But it was happening in a somewhat haphazard fashion prior to House Bill 462. So we created the state direction around station area plans. That every city that has that fixed transit in their city has to do a station area plan. And they have to do that planning, but the planning looks different depending on where you are. Because planning around the light rail stop at Salt Lake International Airport is fundamentally different than planning around a light rail stop in downtown Salt Lake or a front runner stop in Farmington or a front runner stop in Provo. But each of them have a role to play in maximizing the land near those transit stops. So because of stationary plans, and the deadline to get those plans certified isn't even until the end of next year, but thus far with stationary plans, we've seen cities plan for and get plans certified for 24,000 housing units that previously were not contemplated within a half mile of those transit stops. I think that's a great success story so far, and let's keep the conversation going.
Thanks, Cam. My name is Alyssa Daly. I'm the Political Affairs Director for the Utah Association of Realtors, and get to serve with these fine gentlemen on the task force, Utah Land Task Force, and we do get out up at the Hill during the legislative session sometimes. But I think the thing Cam and I disagree the most on is that he is a diehard Jazz fan, and I am a diehard Chicago Bulls fan. And so, see, he's shaking his head at me already. I just had to throw that out there. But we've worked through that, which has helped us, I think, to be able to work through what can be really difficult, big issues in the land use space. And I say that because Utah is really unique in that, look at all of you here today. There are a lot of varying opinions. There are varying opinions on this panel today, but we all have the end goal of trying to keep Utah great. Now, this is going to sound a little bit like a brag, but when Gambrulis was a state employee, I was not born yet. So thank you for filling me in on the back history of Utah and what it was like before I got here. But I've been with the Realtors Association for 10 years. And what's interesting about my time with the Realtors is that I've got to live as a millennial through the big things that we're trying to work through here as a state, as developers, as the league, government, private interest groups like the one I represent. But I've lived that. I bought my first home. I bought a twin home in American Fork in 2014. I had been married 9 months. I made $53,000 a year, and I paid $215,000 for that house. And I thought my face was gonna melt off the day that I signed those mortgage papers. It felt like so much money, and I had no idea how we were gonna make it work, right? But we did make it work, and it changed our lives. And I could tell you a lot of reasons why the 18,000 members that I have the honor of representing up at Capitol Hill and in your municipalities on local land use issues, why they care. But fundamental to being a realtor in Utah is caring about and protecting the American dream of home ownership, right? Most of my members, their lives have been changed by home ownership in more ways than one, right? They've experienced the benefits in their own lives. They've watched their clients' lives change. A lot of our realtor members have clients that stay with them through multiple home purchases over time. And so they really do believe, and we believe in the American dream and the importance of the American dream in keeping Utah. And something that has kind of become my Roman Empire when we're talking about these issues is some information that Steve Waldrop shared up at the Capitol in a CHA presentation a few weeks ago about how right between 90 and 94%, depending on the county you're looking at, of renters in Utah can't afford the median home in their county, which means that they are barred from the benefits of home ownership. And that for me, that means that something really, really detrimental is happening to the middle class in Utah, which is one of the reasons that I came here out of state. I'm a transplant from Texas, right? But we had such a robust middle class that it was so appealing to me. So many things were appealing to me about Utah, and I'm a proud Texan. My parents still don't talk to me because I stayed here and didn't come back to Texas. No, not really. But the issues that we're talking about, they're really big human issues, and I think that's kind of the point you're getting back to, Chris, that this isn't about development, this is about home ownership, and at the end of the day, home ownership is about people, and I'll leave that there.
All right, I'm going to go park myself up at the podium kind of to orchestrate things, but we would like to now open it up and have a conversation between you as the audience, whether the questions or comments that you have, and our panelists here. Any comments you'd like to make, any questions that you have, and maybe we can generate some heated conversation, or at least warming conversation. So with that, I'm going to hand this mic back to them, and then look for anyone who has any questions or comments at this time.
We have a question from the audience online.
Oh, great, okay.
And this is a follow-up to Representative White's comments, but since members on the panel are part of the Land Use Task Force and can anticipate with precision exactly what's going to happen in the next legislature, this is the question from online. What are the discussions regarding external ADUs? Is there a plan for the legislature to require external ADUs in all communities?
Who wants to take that one? Start it off. Chris, you want to start us off with
Well,
that?
from my perspective, yeah, we've been having these conversations actually at the Commission on Housing Affordability, and would want to make it more subtle than House Bill 82, which was the internal ADU, but around I think around lot sizes there would be some bumpers around that. But the thought being that, in a lot of neighborhoods, particularly in legacy cities, cities that are really built out, it's not easy to convert your home with an internal ADU. And not everybody wants an internal ADU. I'm actually building a new home and I've been designing it with my wife, and I said, hey, that'd be cool if we had an internal ADU. And she was like, that would not be cool at all. We are not doing that. And I was like, okay, that is, so we're not. But I think that it does make some sense to have the discussions around external ADUs. And I'm gonna say in a lot of legacy cities, there's such an excess of infrastructure in these legacy cities. So we spent 4 years battling a group of NIMBY neighbors in the avenues. And yes, progressives in the avenues are just as NIMBY as more conservative people in the suburbs. They are, or if not worse. But we had our friend Chris Nilsson do an analysis of the population through census tracts in the avenues for us, because they were saying that these 21 new homes in the avenues were going to stress all of the infrastructure. Well, guess what? From 2000 to 2018, in the census tract, we're talking about the population had decreased by 1,000 people. Imagine if we had gone back to like 1970, when there were tons of kids, lots of houses. There's 3 elementary schools in the avenues. There's 1 today. The population of the avenues has decreased dramatically, and all that infrastructure, the water, the sewer, there is no storm drain, but that infrastructure is there, the roads, it's all there. And in a lot of these legacy cities, there's a way to densify them with external ADUs that I think would create a better outcome than doing what like California's done or Minneapolis, where they've just eliminated all single-family zoning, so you can take your house down and build a 4-plex in a lot of places. I don't know if that's the right solution for every neighborhood, but maybe some external ADUs would be a better way to do that.
Excellent points, Chris. And I'm going to address that question by talking a little bit about the legacy city issues, because Chris and I actually agree on a lot of these challenges around our legacy cities. Salt Lake City, you mentioned the avenues. I'm going to take a step back from one particular project and talk just Salt Lake City as a whole. But it's
Cam, would you define what a legacy
that's right.
city is?
Yeah, that's what we do. So take a step back from the avenues project specifically to talk Salt Lake City as a whole. So Salt Lake City is a city where most of the housing stock is several decades, if not over a century old. And you look at a lot of our communities that are older pioneer type communities that are built out and don't have a lot of excess green space available, from Ogden to Provo, Salt Lake being one of them. So a couple interesting tidbits about Salt Lake City, and again, this is reflective of what you could find in Ogdens and Provos of the world. Salt Lake City currently has the largest population that it's ever had. Largest population it's ever had. Salt Lake City also currently has the smallest school-age population that it's ever had. Now that's a fascinating dichotomy. So at the same time Salt Lake City has the largest daytime population it's ever had, Salt Lake City School District just closed 4 elementary schools. And that's on top of the 2 elementary schools that closed in the previous round, one of which was in the avenues down the street from that proposal, from that project. Okay, so if you were a policymaker in that legacy city and you're concerned about the hollowing out of your city and losing families, then what are the different policy levers that you could potentially pull? And then what's the role of the local government versus what's the role of the state government? And then what's the role of the private sector? Like, how do these pieces all come together? Well, if anybody's been in downtown Salt Lake City recently, you'll see a huge increase in the number of large-scale apartment buildings, and particularly large-scale luxury multifamily units. So you're seeing huge growth in population, and in fact, Salt Lake City had to build new water infrastructure in the lower avenues to tap water from City Creek in order to support all of the downtown redevelopment. But all that downtown redevelopment isn't bringing families or home ownership into the city. They're 1 and 2 bedroom and studio apartments. Meanwhile, if you come out to Sugar House has been under construction for what, the last decade? That's not why you're moving, right? No.
We're neighbors, by the way. We're neighbors. We live like 100 feet from each other.
Well, and speaking of NIMBYs, I moved in a few months ago, and now he's moving out. So,
Why is that happening?
Nevertheless, for those of you who've been to Sugar House recently, you know there's been a tremendous amount of infrastructure construction because they're in the process of upzoning, or not upsizing all of the infrastructure because of the increase in development in that area. So even though maybe in the heart of the avenues where that particular project is occurring, there's excess infrastructure, there was not excess infrastructure in downtown Salt Lake or in Sugar House, but that's where the private sector demand has been to build more and more commercial and residential structures, but the residential structures that are getting built are primarily apartments, which aren't helping in the owner occupancy and home ownership rungs of the ladder. So this is in part why local control matters so much, because the elected officials of Salt Lake City are very aware of all these moving pieces, and they're trying to meet these different policy objectives of how do we get more home ownership, how do we get more affordability, how do we make sure that the infrastructure is sustainable, and how do we ensure the quality of life of our current and future residents. And those four things I just highlighted, ownership, affordability, sustainable infrastructure, quality of life, those are the same principles that the League Board, which includes Salt Lake, but Salt Lake's just one of 255 cities and towns, but our League Board has endorsed as well to say, as we're having these conversations with the state, do these policy outcomes, do these policy levers get to these principles? So with respect to a state mandate around external ADUs with bumpers, right now it is part of the conversation. Our organization's not prepared to say yes or no on it, but it's part of the conversation. But I think the bigger piece of this is any of the levers that we're considering at the State House, will they result in more affordability? Will they result in more ownership? Will they result in sustainable infrastructure? Will they result in better quality of life? And are they respecting the roles of the private sector, the state, and local government as we're working together?
Melissa, any comments?
I think the only thing I'd add is when we're having a conversation about external ADUs, I think we have to kind of take a 10,000-foot step back, especially when we're talking about enacting state policy that you're going to implement at the local level, right? And so kind of the political nuance kind of begins and ends with you. You're the one that's going to have to explain to a resident your external ADU policy and how that's going to impact them. And so for me, I think you have to take it all the way back to what is your definition of private property rights, because that is where we get a little bit sticky, and maybe it's an agree to disagree thing, right? But I heard earlier today in the conversation, there have been comments about, well, I bought into a neighborhood with a certain aesthetic, a certain style, and if my neighbor puts an external ADU in their backyard, then that impacts my private property rights. I would argue that it doesn't impact your private property rights because they didn't come onto your property and build an external ADU. They built it on their property. Now, I think guardrails, like Cam mentioned, are really important because you do need to be a good neighbor, right? And that's something that in the real estate community we talk a lot about. You can't sell a home in a bad neighborhood, right? Or a crappy neighborhood, or however you want to define that, right? And so I think we're all invested in having great communities, and external ADUs don't need to be a threat to great communities, but we do need to remember kind of the backdrop and foundational conversation, which is private property rights. And I would be curious to know how you guys think about walking through that, especially at the local level.
So maybe just to stay on this ADU conversation a little bit, and then maybe to get to John on one of the slides that he had. Share an anecdote with you. When I was planning director at Salt Lake City, over 10 years ago, we were looking at implementing the policy, as Cam mentioned, with a legacy city and being the way it was. We were looking at allowing for ADUs in the city. We were proposing to change the city's ordinance that would allow for ADUs, certainly more so than anything that had been built there in the past. And we were going around to the various community councils in the city and getting their feedback, letting them know what we were doing and getting their feedback. We were in the Avenues with the Avenues Community Council. I know the chair there very well. An older gentleman lived in the area for many, many years, and he was chairing the meeting. We were having the discussion about ADUs, and frankly, the discussion was, to me, pretty evenly split about those who thought it was a good idea and those who didn't like the idea. At the end of the conversation, the chair got up and he said, well, I think you can clearly hear now that we are opposed to ADUs here in the Avenues, and we'll be sending a letter in that regard to the city council. And I didn't want to challenge him right during the meeting, but I went up to him afterwards and I said, Dave, to me it seemed really pretty evenly split, the comments that you had. And you're saying that represents an opposing view? And he said, well, many of those people that were here that were saying they were in favor of ADUs, they don't normally come to our community council meetings. And I was like, holy cow, how does that make a difference? But John, you had a slide in there talking about ADUs.
If I may, I think a lot of this relates to, and again, I'm trained as an economist, so I'm boring by nature going into this topic. But it seems to me a lot of this is related to risk aversion. People oppose ADUs even when it's not on their property because their home is the largest investment they will likely ever make. So people become incredibly risk averse when it comes to things like this, whether you're talking about density in general or whether you're talking about an ADU next door. And I think this also ties into what Chris was saying earlier about people turning out to oppose residential but not commercial. It's difficult to convince people that additional residential gives them anything. Do I get anything out of this besides possibly a decreased home value that makes my life better? And that's where the persuasion comes in. That's where the language comes in. That's where you have to say something like, you know, okay, we're putting in this, but we're also putting in some cool commercial space, so you'll have a nice boutique or a nice restaurant around the corner, in addition to the additional density. These are important things that tie into messaging and understanding what actually motivates people. It's not because I hate developers. It's because I want to know what's in it for me.
Any other comments, questions with regard to this?
Can I just
or any
respond to
other-
that real quick?
Oh, yeah, okay.
And I'm just going to say,
Hang on.
people aren't owed anything when someone comes in to exercise their private property rights, to change the use of their land. The neighbors aren't owed anything. When they say, well, what's in it for me? I don't know. Maybe, so we've got a large land holding just outside of Colville with LHM. It's about 800 acres. And you go to a city council meeting there, and you'll hear people say, but we don't want to change the nature of our city. There's not a grocery store in Colville anymore. Those people, they drive to Evanston to grocery shop. That's the true story. They drive to Evanston to the Walmart to grocery shop because it's easier and more convenient than going to Kimball's Junction to grocery shop from Colville. 5 years ago, the graduating class of North Summit High School had 75 kids. Today, in their kindergarten class, there's 25 kids. There's two ways that this goes. You either grow or you shrink. And having no grocery store and fewer kids in your high school to the point where it might close down, maybe what you get out of it is a viable community.
One more.
Yeah.
I'm not saying anybody's owed anything. I'm saying to understand how to counter someone's position, you have to understand their actual motivations and appeal to, since we've been alluding to Adam Smith the whole time, to appeal to their self-interests in one way or another to make something more viable.
Okay. There was a question here. Craig, if we could get a mic?
Craig.
Up here.
Craig.
There we go.
I'm just curious about, like, in a practical sense, using ADUs as a tool for housing affordability. And this is me coming from someone, I've owned two houses, both of them have had ADUs. When I went to purchase the home, I couldn't find a lender who would count the rental income for the ADU towards my debt to income ratio. So for these people who were talking about it, saying, okay, we want people to get into home ownership, like, how can we use this to help them?
HUD issued guidance on that, and now lenders will count the income, the potential income. You don't even have to rent it. You just have to demonstrate that there is a potential income, and they will count it towards your ability to make your payment.
That's a sweet change. So, I mean, and that's great for home builders too, because you could start a whole new home building community with ADUs in all of them, and your sales price is going to be up a little bit because people can qualify for the mortgages a little easier.
The 21 homes we're going to build in the avenues all have ADUs with them, and that was the primary reason for 4 years of opposition by people who live in a 6-story condo building, by the way, if you're wondering, because we weren't in the neighborhood character, but they live in a 6-story condo building.
Hypothetically, if you also wanted to take the extreme approach, just make lots more easily subdividable, sell your ADU.
So to that, some of you may have heard what's going on in Farmington. Dave, I'm going to put you on the spot. But would you just briefly describe for us what your city has just recently done with regard to ADUs? And I certainly like your new acronym for ADUs that you're using. You might share that as well.
Yeah, in Farmington, we adopted an ordinance in July, and we've been doing detached ADUs since 2002, but the acronym's DADU, a DADU. And, but we decided that we'd allow our dad use to be for sale units. And so the city council paved a way where we can carve out the dad use and have it be its own for sale unit, separate from the single family home, even if it's tucked behind without access to the road. And now it's no longer a dad use because it's not accessory to the principal dwelling. We call it an SSF, a subordinate single family. And we immediately had some interest. We're up to number 9 now on people wanting to do it, and we have some almost building permit applications in the queue because they're working with their designers and stuff like that. But we're hoping it's a way to help people get some equity. And then in Farmington also we have a requirement if they provide 10% of their housing stock as for moderate income house or for a moderate income household, we allow a bump in density from basically doubling the lot, not doubling the lot size, but where it was a 20,000 square foot lot zone, it becomes a 10,000 square foot lot zone. And that's the big carrot. And so far, most every developer, yeah, I want to do that. I want to double my density. It's not quite double, but in order to do that, 10% of your housing stock has to be moderate income housing. And now we're exploring the path of these detached ADUs that are for sale can help the developer meet that. And so we're working with 3 developers now as they're implementing them in their plans. And so we hope this gains some traction. Interestingly enough, even though the ordinance has only been adopted for 3 months now, we have 2 or 3 sentences we'd like to change in our ordinance. When we start implementing, it's like, why do we write the sentence that way? And so we are just moving forward on that. So,
can I ask how you set that up? Sorry, thank you. Can I ask how you set that up with the DADU in terms of access, driveways, that sort of thing? Just were they deeded to both properties, like access?
We already been doing the DADU, a rental, for a long time, and without any problems. So it's the exact same thing, but they have to have a permanent easement now.
Right.
And the big one is they can't go off the services from the main home. They can't go off the sewer or the culinary water. They have to have their own laterals back there to that unit.
Cool.
And so that's a big one to tackle. We, I hear these comments too, and Chris mentioned them about the infrastructure, and it was talked about this morning. The household size has dropped so much. When I started working in Farmington, our household size was over 4. And now it's not. It's still fairly high compared to other places in Utah. But you can only flush a toilet so many times. You have so many people in that household and take so many showers. But if the household size has dropped so dramatically that we do have the infrastructure in older parts of town.
Yeah.
And the other thing too is the roads, our local streets, our traffic engineers, oh yeah, they can easily handle. With the household size dropping so much, the number of cars and other things on the street is far less too. And so, I'm supposing, I asked our attorney here, are we legacy city? And he said yes, because I didn't know the definition either. But our older parts of town are able to handle this so far. So, I mean, so far as we can tell for the future.
Well, let me jump in here, because I think both of these comments are very illustrative of the challenges and opportunities around external ADUs, and again, gets back to the question of what's the problem we're trying to solve, and are we getting to the outcome that we want? So, Dave, you asked if Farmington was a legacy city, and my somewhat tongue-in-cheek response is east of the freeway, yes. West of the freeway, probably not. And there is no formal definition of legacy city, but I think Farmington is a really fascinating case study of what the community was designed for 40 years ago versus what the community is now, and where your infrastructure is in one part of town looks different from your infrastructure in another part of town. So whenever there is dialogue around a state mandate, that state mandate inevitably is not going to be able to look at the nuance in a Farmington and say, we have extra capacity on the east side of the city, but maybe we don't in this part of the city. Or again, using my Salt Lake example, excess capacity in the heart of the avenues, but massive upsizing necessary to accommodate growth in other parts of the city. Then your question about the financing of ADUs is also a really interesting one, because historically ADUs have been primarily used for either long-term rentals or short-term rentals. So at least for the occupant of the ADU, that occupant isn't able to get into home ownership. Now, maybe it makes it easier for the owner of the initial unit, but it also could drive up the initial sale price because now there's that second unit. And that's been one of the consequences we've seen from IADUs, is that a unit without an IADU is less expensive than a unit with an IADU. So now with that IADU, or any sort of ADU, are you basically saying, I can only afford it if I become a landlord or have the opportunity to become a landlord? Again, I'm not saying one's right or wrong, but these are all the different policy questions that we need to be asking when we talk about potential state action, because the state action may not be able to equate for all the infrastructure differences. And then is it actually getting to affordable home ownership, or is it just getting to affordability? And there are, again, pros and cons to that. What's really intriguing about the Farmington model, and it's one of the first, not just the first in Utah, but one of the first around the country that is trying to pivot the traditional thought process around ADUs to how do you turn ADUs into a starter home? And how do you create an ownership opportunity for the occupant of that ADU? So even though it's a brand new ordinance, we invited Farmington to present at our conference just a few weeks ago, and you guys had a great turnout, and there was a lot of interest and a lot of questions about it, because I think what Farmington's trying to unlock is the same question I think your survey demonstrated, that cities want to be part of the solutions, and they want the solutions to be focused around affordable home ownership, which is something we can all agree on here. So how do we pull the policy levers in a way that gets to those outcomes?
All
Oh,
right.
just one more comment.
Yeah, Dave.
Farmington is one of 3 cities that was established in 1847. So I think we are a legacy community.
All right, what other issues? What other things do we want to talk about up here, Craig?
Going back to the ADU and the Farmington new ordinance, how does that interact with HOAs, CCNRs? Does the new ordinance trump all that? I mean, we can't even put chickens in our backyard, but we can put an ADU. How does that work?
Well, there was something in the state code with regard to ADUs, right?
You can.
So as you go to Farmington, let me address it with the internal ADU bill that Chris referenced, House Bill 82 from a few years ago.
Yeah.
In that bill, the legislature not only dictated and mandated to cities to allow internal ADUs under certain circumstances, they had that same mandate on HOAs. And it was actually really fascinating, because generally the legislature is hesitant about interfering with the right to contract, and HOA is a contract. But in this case, the legislature at the time said the housing crisis is so important that we don't think an HOA should be able to say no. So if we're going to require this of cities and the land use authorities, then we're going to require it of HOAs. That's on the internal side, but I'm curious on the Farmington piece specifically too.
Good thing our city attorney is sitting right here.
We're reluctant to have the city override HOAs. I think the state has a lot more authority to do that than we did. So we didn't specifically address it. If an HOA said you can't have an external ADU, it would prohibit it in our city still. I would be in favor of the state overriding that.
And it'll be interesting to see, because there's a lot of discussion, as we've heard, about external ADUs in this legislative session. It'll be interesting to see if they put these same kind of provisions in there.
Just another note, one of the reasons why I asked Governor Cox about, just mention it takes a while for people to change. You know, when we first adopted our detached ADU ordinance, it was only one family started it all. They built a detached ADU for their disabled son, The neighbors were pretty accepting of it. A couple of people said, hey, that violates our ordinance. So we set up an ADU ordinance, just detached ADU ordinance, just for family members you couldn't rent. A couple of years goes by, there's no impact. People say, hey, let's do it, let's broaden it out. Let's say you can rent those now. A few years go by, and the Planning Commission says, okay, we're tired of reviewing these conditional use applications on our agendas. They're getting so routine. Staff, you get it. A couple of years go by. In January, we said, how about we do a for sale? Yeah. And so it took a while for the community to get to this point. It just doesn't happen quickly. And so, I mean, for us, it didn't.
All right, what other issues do we want to talk about based on the things that we heard behind you there, Craig?
When the state passed that law a couple years ago, my thriving metropolis of Rockville was dead set against any type in the land use code, whether it's internal or external ADU, and we obviously had to implement that due to that. And that kind of helped out in some sense because, like was mentioned, you know, us being a gateway city in that to Zion National Park, Rockville has struggled or tried really hard not to become like Springdale or Virgin in that, where they're exploding. So they want to keep it quite rural in nature. And so for us, the sentiment is the only way to really do it is if the state passes the law for external units as well. And part of the issue there also is there's you have a lot of families that are pioneer families that own that land, and they are dead set against changing, and unfortunately the only way to get them out of there is when they die. So
I just want to make a couple connections here in these issues. I don't want this to be just an external ADU conversation,
Yeah.
but one of the reasons why I think, and we've been talking about external ADUs at the Commission on Housing Affordability, and it's, Representative Ray Ward was at interim last week talking about this, but the state just adopted this last year a statewide modular code for modular construction. And so I'm going to try and connect some dots here, and that is that when I talk to a lot of mayors, and I've talked to Mayor Silvestrini about this and Troy Walker from Draper, there's this thought that every external ADU is it's a 3-car garage with a unit over the top and someone's kids living up there. But it doesn't have to be that. There's an external ADU in our neighborhood is it finished yet? I don't know if it's finished yet, not quite. It's just a small little cottage on a small lot in Sugar House. And what would have been much easier is if they had craned in, a modular unit, a little 1-bedroom unit in the backyard, connected sewer and water to it. It would have been operational in 20 days from the time they ordered it. So if we're thinking about what external ADUs can be, I think some of the bumpers are around like lot sizes and setbacks and those kinds of things, and certainly height. But I think it would be really smart of us to encourage modular external ADUs under certain circumstances, because I don't think that they're as impactful, and the statewide modular code really, I think, is going to move the needle in that regard.
I certainly agree with Chris on the impact long-term of the state modular code. And this is one of 20 plus bills just in the time since the Commission on Housing Affordability started, and one of 70 plus bills since the Land Use Task Force started, where we've been able to get to consensus on policy that we think will make a positive difference for the state of Utah. So with respect to the state modular code, Chris and I actually sat on a very similar panel at the University of Utah last fall that Ivory hosted, And do you remember there were these national experts that put me on the panel expecting me to be the voice of no because cities around the country had said no to modular. I finally had to tell them, like, no, our organization has endorsed this bill because we see modular as a tremendous opportunity here. And I think that demonstrates the collaborative approach we have in Utah compared to other states. Now, you mentioned the Zion Canyon communities, and the Zion Canyon communities, I think, are a perfect example of why we at the League preach at the Capitol one size fits all, because even in the canyon, Virgin, Rockville, and Springdale are all very unique animals, right? So Mayor Bruno of Springdale is serving on one of our subcommittees within the Commission on Housing Affordability. And she's brought a tremendous perspective. Pam Leach in Rockville has brought a great perspective, ditto with Mayor Krause from Virgin. And what's interesting about all three of those different communities is the infrastructure pressures are so incredibly different. So in Springdale, for example, how many people have tried to go to Zion recently? Okay, right. Now, if we'd asked that 20 years ago, almost all of us would have raised our hands, and it'd be pretty easy to go down on any given weekend and access the park. But you can't now, right? The Zion Canyon on any given weekend is difficult to access. So Springdale has actually seen some of their longtime business tenants have their properties turn over not to workforce housing, but to short-term rental, tourism-focused housing. Or lodging, I should say, because it's focused on people coming and going and visiting the park as opposed to workforce for the people who are trying to support the businesses that then generate a tremendous amount of economic return for the town, the canyon, the county, and the state. So Springdale has done some inclusionary zoning incentives, similar to what Farmington was describing, to try to overcome some of the market forces that are at play in Springdale, because they just can't get builders to build workforce housing in that community. Then you've got the next community down is Rockville, which still has very much a pioneer feel to it. And then you get to Virgin. And one interesting thing about Virgin, as I was chatting with Mayor Krause recently about this, is Virgin has had a tug of war around development for the last decade. Some residents are very supportive of development, some aren't. The ones who are supportive of development are handcuffed to a degree because they don't have any more sewer capacity. So even if they could approve, or even if the state mandated you have to allow X, there's no sewer capacity for Virgin to accommodate that sort of growth. And then on the other hand, I mentioned it's a tug of war. You have a lot of residents who don't want to see Virgin change, and so they've had more referendums in Virgin than probably any other community in the state. And so you have this tug of war going back and forth. And I'm not here to say who's right or who's wrong, but those are the on-the-ground real challenges that the communities in Zion Canyon are facing.
So with that said,
Hold on.
I happen to own one of the grandfathered in beds and breakfasts in Rockville. And I was volunteered and am the chair of the Planning and Zoning Commission. And Springdale's septic or sewer system actually resides in Rockville on the other side of Grafton. And they've actually done an expansion for that. If you're down by the river, you have to have a septic system. If you're up along the highway, then you can connect into that. But that's been a major issue there. It's like, okay, do we allow additional septic systems to be down by the river and such, and how do we build those, especially building out any of this stuff? And so there definitely are the challenges there that reside with it, but there are ways of increasing that infrastructure. Like I mentioned, the state, I believe, required that Springdale increase their sewer system, and that's what they've been working on for the last couple months to be able to handle that capacity rather than use septic systems there.
Okay, this has been, we've spent a lot of time on ADUs in this session. Other topics, other issues? Oh, question where at? Right, from Chris over here. Behind Chris?
So I do numbers. So I'm gonna throw some numbers out. By 2060, that's not too far away in the scheme of things, Utah's average age will go from the youngest in the nation to higher than the national average. So by 2060, Utah's average age will be 42, national average will be 41. We get there because of things like falling household sizes and changing household composition. So by 2060, Utah's average household size will fall from the nation's highest in 2020 to below the national average. Then if you look to, say, 2040, which is around the corner, statewide, only 4% of the net change in total households between 2020 and 2040 will have children in them. We'll still have more children in 2040 than now, and more households with children, but they will comprise 4% of the net change in households between now and 2040. Single-person households will comprise about 1/3 of the entire change in new housing demand. And then the rest are multi-adult households without children. They'll be about 65% of the net change. And the net change is going to be 550,000 households. So out of those, only 22,000 will have children in them. And 160,000 will be single-person households. So things like ADUs, internal, external, smaller homes, smaller lots, we need to do more of those things because our composition is changing so fast. By 2030, we're going to be, well, we're doing it now. We're saying what's happened. What's happened is the slow march of demography is changing the face of the state.
Any other response from the panel? Any other questions? We got someone?
Hi, sorry to, I'm beating the dead horse of the ADUs, but I just want to encourage those on the task force to consider, as Cameron said, one size is a misfit for all, because some of the towns that I represent have, limited water, and when you think about the impacts of an ADU on things like water, those water shares were contemplated to be a single-family home, but now what you have is with the mandate of the ADUs, you basically are creating 2 units in every single-family home. And I think that is also exacerbated in places where you have second homes is the predominant ownership, where it's, because Utah is such a beautiful place, you have a lot of places within the state where you have much more second home ownership, and then what happens there is you end up maybe with ADUs that are being used as short-term rentals or facilitating short-term rentals. So it goes back to what you're saying of what's the purpose of this. And to have these state mandates sometimes makes it really difficult for municipalities to allow for it because of the lack of infrastructure. And also, one other thing that I've been struggling with is with the ADUs, you're not abiding by the building code, right? Because it's not viewed as a duplex. I would think that if you do allow for the sale, you need to at least upgrade the building codes to allow for there to be a second dwelling, basically, in that single-family home. So I'd be curious what you guys think.
Panel response, anyone?
I was just going to, a lot has been said around, Cameron's favorite thing, one size misfits all. I actually used that. I borrowed it from him. you know, I mean, growth is here. Even if our family size is dropping, we're still having kids. People are still moving here, and saying that we should, you know, stop growth. I hear that a lot, and I think that we do need to plan for it in a smart way. So one of the things that I've been advocating for quite a number of years, and I hope it gains some traction soon, is around making general plans the legislative act, which would make the rezone an administrative act. And the way, and I say that because I do believe, I believe local control is really the property owner. I think municipal duties and responsibilities are to plan, and you can do that planning. And if the planning, what the state requires in a general plan is there, then adopt it by ordinance, and then make your rezones an administrative function. That's not taking zoning away from cities. It's not what that's doing. You're still leaving it there so that Mill Creek can be Mill Creek, and Rockville can be Rockville, and St. George can be St. George. But you're just planning it and saying, well, you need to accommodate for these kinds of things. I was looking at some data from Envision Utah, and one of the things that stood out to me was that I think they're saying that by 2050, Davis County will have to accommodate 100,000 more people. But there's only like 10 or like 1,000 vacant acres that are buildable, something like that. I mean, we're talking about massive amounts of density, massive numbers of people, but there's no way to accommodate that in greenfield development. The only way to do that would be to densify in certain areas. But I do think that the Land Use Task Force and the Commission on Housing Affordability having conversations with the legislature around cities still doing their own plans, but then making those plans the ordinance adoption, and then it really makes those NIMBY hearings at the rezone, which would only happen at the Planning Commission, and because it's an administrative act, it would be like a preliminary plat approval. It would, I think, change the way that the process works. So I'm just going to drop that,
Yeah, so
and
Chris,
let Cameron.
before Cam, let me sit. Chris has opened up a whole new area for discussion, which I appreciate that. So we can get on to something else to talk about. But this is an interesting area. For those of you who may not be so well versed in the background, general plans in the state of Utah are not mandatory to be complied with. They are advisory. They're aspirational. So when you do a general plan, it's intended to guide growth in your community, but it's not mandatory. You are not mandated to follow what your general plan says. That is the case with a number of other states around the country, but there are states where general plans are mandatory. You have to follow what your general plan says in your land use. And so what Chris is saying, we should switch that here in the state of Utah. A lot of pros and cons to that, a lot of issues that would go around that. One of the things that I've maintained for a long time is I think Chris is hoping to avoid the bloody fights we see all the time over rezonings. I think you're just going to move the venue from rezonings to general plan adoptions. It's a controversial and it's a broad discussion area. Cam, I know you want to respond. Mayor Silvestrini is back there waving his hand. He really wants to say something. So, Cam, why don't you go ahead until Craig gets back there with the mic for the
Okay,
mayor.
perfect. Normally, I defer to my elected officials, and Mayor Silvestrini is a former league president. So since Craig's there, I'm going to let Mayor Silvestrini go first, and then I'll respond.
All right.
Okay, so Chris and I have had this debate a lot, but let me tell you you know, as Wilf said, general plans generally are advisable. And, you know, a general plan is a big, broad plan for a whole city, as opposed to a specific zone. I want to tell you an anecdote, because we legislate by anecdotes in Utah sometimes. This is something, I have 3 planning commissioners here from the Mill Creek Planning Commission, and they're familiar with this project. We just had, we've had an application for someone to basically do a tear down of a single-family residence on 0.43 acres. The Planning Commission, following the general plan, recommended denial to the City Council. The applicant wants to build 5 units of housing on this particular piece of property. And in discussions going through a process with neighbors, they agreed to reduce the density from 6 units to 5 units, and they agreed to make them owner-occupied, subject to a deed restriction. The City Council is in favor of approving that application. However, it contradicts the general plan, and the Planning Commission denied it, saying, hey, we need to do a general plan amendment, go through a bunch more process before we feel like we could approve this. The City Council, I think, is being a little bold, saying this provides the kind of housing that we want to see in our city. It's infill, it increases the density from 1 unit to 5, and it secures owner occupancy. If we did what you were doing, Chris, we wouldn't be able to do that. We need to have flexibility to be able to adapt to situations where there is good development that we could consider, but if we just you know, had a static general plan and used that as the guide, we would not be approving this project.
So just because you adopt it by ordinance doesn't mean it can't be amended by ordinance. So in our avenues where we got the rezone successful, there was also a general plan amendment. That general plan had been adopted by ordinance in 1987 when Ronald Reagan was the president. So how static was that? Well, it wasn't static. You can still have those conversations and amend the general plan. That would still be another legislative act. But here's my experience has been that if I'm talking to city planning and engineering and public works staff, and I'm like, you know, I know that road is in your general plan right there, but it would be better for our project if we moved it over. It'd be like, no, I mean, do you know how much effort we put into this general plan? Like you can't move roads. Those are collector roads. You can't move those. Well, how about if we rezone this commercial to high density? No, that's in our general plan as commercial. We can't rezone that to residential. It's in our general plan that way. And those would be reasons to deny it. But if somebody said, in your general plan, this is planned for high density or medium density, and there's a bunch of NIMBYs that come in, the answer is, you know, the general plan it's advisory. We don't actually have to do that. So there are elements of the general plans today that are looked at as immutable, and then what's left is residential development. That is the advisory part of general plans. That is where cities will rely on the advisory element of the general plan, is in residential rezones. So
Take it away,
now
Tim.
you know why Mayor Silvestrini stood up so fast.
Chris and I agree that planning matters. And ultimately, the question of where is this line of when things become quote unquote binding is a really interesting one. And I think it actually comes back a step earlier to yesterday's conversation around the difference between a legislative act and an administrative act. For most general plans do not have, let me back up. So general plans are that aspirational plan for the community, but they don't have the level of detail that your zoning map or your zoning ordinances will have. But in both the cases of the planning and the zoning, those are efforts by legislative bodies that approve them to set policy for the city, and the policy making is what makes those legislative acts. At some point, you move past the policy making to the implementation side. And what Chris is pointing out is that if you moved that further up in the process to get to the administrative piece, then from his perspective, you would start to avoid the pushback from the public because it's an administrative act. Either you meet the requirements of the ordinance or you don't. It's not a policy-making decision anymore. But this is a key point that Wilf brought up, that right now you have a system of general plans that don't have that same level of specificity for the zoning map. So if you made general plans, that binding legislative act, you're essentially just combining general plan and zoning. You're not actually getting over that obstacle of what happens when you start to get the pushback from the public. And the legislative power is the people's power. And that is true at a city level, it's true at a state level, it's true at the federal level. The legislative power is the people's power. And so if we were to go down the path of saying zoning is an administrative act, one, the courts would disagree because it's setting policy, but two, we're really talking about what is the role of the people. Ultimately, where I think the more productive conversation for better outcomes goes along the line of what Brent and Wilf and Todd were talking about yesterday, which is better process around administrative acts, because the administrative act really ought to just be either you meet the standard or you don't. And I think we've made really good strides in recent years around clarifying that step. And I'll give it as an example. A couple years ago, a bill that we worked closely on around subdivisions. The subdivision process is an administrative act. But because LUDMA had been relatively silent on subdivisions, the default action by cities around the state, cities and counties around the state, was to have their city councils, the legislative body, making those administrative approvals. We'll talk about confusion for the general public. They're frustrated with the subdivision because that's now they're seeing the homes under construction, so they want to come in with their pitchforks, and the city council they view as you are my voice because you're the elected official. Well, in that task, the city council is not the voice of the people. The city council was the administrator. Either you meet the standard or you don't. And so it set the public up to fail, it set city councils up to fail, and it set developers up to fail, right? Where all of a sudden you are now being asked to change things and you're saying, well, wait a minute, it's just another fight, right? Mm-hmm. So we've tried to address that in recent legislation. And if you are someone out here who represents cities or towns, and this is new to you, please grab a league staffer here so we can help make sure you know what you need to do to update your subdivision ordinances. We got some money from the state to help with that technical assistance, because we think over time that's going to make a huge difference to avoid some of the fights that Chris is referencing. Now, subdivisions are one administrative act, and there are a lot of other administrative acts in the land use space where we could have these types of conversations of who does it, what's the role of the public, and have that clarity. And one handout that I brought today for all of my city and county folks, in fact, quick show of hands, how many of you here represent a city, town, or county? Okay, so about 2/3 of them. And then how many of you represent private sector or you're on your own? Yeah, so about a third. Okay, yeah, good mix here. We put together this cheat sheet for our conference last month, and we gave it to mayors and council members of the common concerns that we hear at the Capitol about city compliance with recent land use laws. And subdivisions is number one here on the process side. Because ultimately, I do think we as local governments need to be better. We ask the state to respect our role as cities and towns and to respect the role of the duly elected mayors and council members. But at the same time, the state is expecting more of us. And in light of our growth challenges and the responsibilities we face at the local level, that is a fair ask. So how do we make sure that we are meeting those expectations at City Hall? And some of those are simply customer service, and then some of those are policy, and then it's anywhere in between. So this cheat sheet, we actually worked with the Home Builders Association and others to get feedback of what are the frustrations that Ivory and others are seeing in their day-to-day interactions with local governments. So we could give it to mayors and council members and say, don't be the city that comes up at the Capitol for why the legislature needs to change law and why the legislature needs to take authority away from cities. Don't be that city. What? Oh, yeah, don't be that city. So I've got plenty of these for the city and town folks here, and even for the private sector folks. You're welcome to take one too. We want to be partners with the private sector and with the state as we tackle these challenges, whether it's on the planning side, the zoning side, or the administrative side.
We were talking behind your back. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
I'll take this one. Just kidding. So I just want to touch on, so we're talking general plans, connecting a couple of dots here. And I think what we're really talking about big picture is intensity. How can we take some of the intensity and some of the personal interest out of this? And this was not I didn't coin this term, but I'm going to steal it from Nelson Holmes. They talked a lot about stretch investment, which I really like. To solve these issues, we're all going to have to stretch a little bit. And when you talk about administrative acts versus legislative acts, there's something really intense. There's an intensity to a legislative act, especially around land use issues. And those can be, that intensity, you can be insulated from that when you move towards how can we make things more administrative. That's not to say to disconnect it from the people, but when you have a legislative act, especially at the local level, and I'll give an example here, but you guys have to answer a really tough question, which is which of your residents are you going to represent? So is it the ones that already own a home and own property and don't want anything to change? Is it the resident that's living in their parents' basement because they can't afford to live in the community that they grew up in, but they really want to stay there? And so you have to start balancing a lot of things. And I just recently went to a planning commission meeting, and they did a lot of zoning changes before the ordinance issue that I was there to listen on for work came up. And a resident got up, and I guess he goes to he's like an unofficial member of the planning commission, I learned. He is at every meeting. And he got up to speak in favor of a zoning change and to welcome in a development because they were half-acre lots, and he approved of them. He thought that it would be a great addition because it was cohesive with his neighborhood. What was really interesting to me is how responsive that planning commission and then later on the city council is to those specific residents, because they have residents that aren't afforded the opportunity to go and physically be present. A lot of Utah families now are double income families. Both parents are working, their kids to juggle. And so attending a planning commission meeting or even an evening city council meeting, like, I do think that we have a tendency to forget that that is a privilege for a lot of people, and that just because the residents that are in front of you are saying one thing, and it's very easy to say, well, this is intense. I got all of these angry residents, NIMBYs, whatever we want to call them, so that must be how the residents of my city feel. We're not getting a complete picture. And so when we take a broader look at what the intensity around these issues and what should be a legislative act and what should be an administrative act, it all comes back to what you said, Cam, about how that legislative power really rests with the people, but then we have to answer the question, which people, and make sure that we're being judicious in how we respond to that question.
All right, we are getting very close to lunchtime, but I want to give any of you out there that want to take an opportunity to say something on this topic, big new topic. Probably a lot that can be said. Just recognize you're standing between everybody else and lunch. So go ahead.
I'll make it quick then. An interesting point to the citizens showing up and complaining about stuff. I'm a home builder in Cache Valley. Last year I was the president of the Home Builders Association. And we sent out 265 invites to everybody we could think of that was a city council, planning, zoning, anybody, mayors, everybody in the county, and said, we'd love to get together. You're not going to solve the housing problem on your own. We're not, as builders, going to solve it on our own. Let's get together. We had one response from one city planner, and he invited us, and we went and met with him. And he said, we need condos. And he explained how he had been able to get into a single-family home on his own back in Cache Valley, because early on in his life he was able to buy a condo, and it afforded him home ownership. He said, great, what do we do? And he goes, oh, well, we wouldn't be able to approve it if you submitted for it, but we need them. So the cities are recognizing that. But I was surprised that of all the invites, we had one person respond to us. We ended up having a meeting, and luckily to that meeting, we had probably about 10 from the county show up. And we were able to have a discussion on how do we solve this together. And we're gonna do this every year up there. But by chance, I ended up at a city council meeting in a city where we're gonna do a development. And it happened to be a meeting where they were voting, it was a public comment meeting, where they were voting on a citywide tax increase of 5%, possibly 7. They were pushing for 7, but they ended up settling on 5. There was 0 people there. It was me and my business partner sitting in that entire room. Not a single public comment about a 5% tax increase for the whole city. But yet when we show up to put a subdivision in, you got a room full of people saying, please don't build that in our neighborhood. It's just interesting that that's the sentiment. And so Ari's comment about how do we train, how do we get this out there? How do we talk to the public about the impact of not having a place for your children to live, not having a home because you want a half-acre lot because that's what you have, versus that's not going to work. The average price in Cache Valley is over $400,000 now. It's crazy what we're having to fight against. But a lot of it comes down to those 265 people that didn't show up to talk to us as home builders are very uneducated on what processes they need to follow to solve these problems. And some of these things we've talked about today, fantastic ideas. To see them hit the ground and actually come into implementation is extremely rare and extremely difficult.
All right, thank you. Yeah, let's, any concluding comments from the panel, and then we're off to lunch.
I'm going to respond and do conclude at the same time, so one-stop shop here, and then I'll let everybody else go. I applaud you for making the outreach and trying to meet with folks, and I'd urge you to not give up. Next week, the Cache Summit is happening, so usually you have a lot of good turnout there from local elected officials and otherwise. I mentioned this resource we have. We also have a resource, I'll be presenting on it later, but this is a table of all the different tools that the legislature has passed just this last session, where it really reflects the partnership between the development community and local governments as we're trying to get to owner-occupied affordable units. And we've got plenty of these for folks as they want them too, because to me, the main takeaway from this event and just in general how we approach this is that it has to be in the spirit of partnership, and we have to be having the conversations around what happens if we don't plan responsibly. But that's almost a fear tactic. The better way to do it is what happens when we do plan responsibly. And here we are in the Cairns district of Sandy, and when I was growing up, I grew up in Murray. Southtown Mall was basically the end of Salt Lake Valley until VF Factory Outlets in the prison, and then it ended for a while longer. And never did I think growing up as a kid that the Southtown Mall would turn into, and still in the process of turning into, a mixed-use center with lots of housing units, a theater, a light rail station on one side, and a front runner station on the other. To me, that's a perfect example of doing really good planning and having the conversations with the public and saying, if we plan well, look at the amenities that we can bring to the community. It gets to the self-interest piece, but I'm using softer terms because I'm talking more about the quality of life component. And the quality of life component may be the restaurant. The quality of life component may be that your kids and grandkids can live nearby. How do we focus on that quality of life? Because at the end of the day, your business as realtors, your business as builders, and our business as city leaders really comes down to that quality of life piece. And so my hope is that all of us can walk out of here with that focus, and then we work on trying to implement these tools. And I'm happy to be a resource today, and the league in general wants to be part of this conversation and helping to solve these problems.
Your time's up. Give it to Alyssa.
We all need timers. We like this topic way too much. So I would just say, for those of you that are working on this at the ground level, at the municipal level, if you're looking for a partner to work with your city on educating your residents, letting them know more, maybe you have a big zoning change that you want to make, or you have a creative ordinance around ADUs or whatever it may be, if it touches housing, the realtor community would love to partner with you on that. Like I said at the beginning, part of being a member of the realtor family in Utah is being a politically engaged citizen. So odds are I've got a few hundred realtors near your area that would be willing to, you know, engage with you on these issues. We want to be a good partner on educating the public, and it's not on you as an elected official to educate your public by yourself. That's why we're all up here doing this together. The last thing I would say is that we talked a lot getting ready for this panel about how housing is a moral imperative. It's also an economic necessity. And going back to your slides about self-interest and the true cost of things, right? A one-off property owner might say, I'm really worried about how growth is going to impact my bottom line, my equity, right? But I think long-term, if we're going to have some long-term really high costs if we don't grow right, because we are going to grow, and there are big costs to growth if it's not done well. Like the governor said, growth is neutral. How you handle it is what makes it good or bad, and that's a big group effort. So please reach out if you need help on a project. We're in.
So I just want to conclude with a project that we've been talking to the Office of Property Rights Ombudsman about for the last year or so. That is coming up with a really good, easy to read tool for applicants, land use applicants, and for municipal employees. And it's rights and responsibilities of land use applicants and duties and powers of municipal and county governments. And the idea being that generally speaking, the applicants that come in, they do have some rights, but they also have some responsibilities. They've got to, they should fill out their applications complete. They should understand the implications. They should do those things, but they have those rights. And then making sure that they understand that the people on the other side of the counter have some powers. They don't have rights, but they do have powers and they have duties. And I think if we can come up with the right language around that, and I know that the OPRO board has been working on trying to get to the conclusion of that I'm really hopeful that when someone comes to the counter, whether they're a sophisticated, knowledgeable builder or developer, whoever, or just somebody who wants to put an ADU in their backyard, right, that you can give them a tool that will make sure that they're better and they're better equipped to communicate as they're trying to move their application through.
I also would like to thank you for the comment that I think highlights the degree to which this is an exercise in messaging and dialogue and vocabulary and engagement, to highlight that we are talking about policies that relate to communities and not strictly individuals.
All right, we'd like to thank our panel, and we appreciate their time and effort here. And we thank you as an audience for your participation as well in contributing to this discussion. We are ready for lunch. We're going to let Craig describe what's going to happen here and then the rest of the day.
Yes, thank you. Again, great session. Appreciate it. I thought it would be a good idea to tell you what the sandwich choices are, so you can keep in mind what you'd like, and as soon as you see it, you could grab it without having to cruise the whole room, because there's a lot of us and it's kind of a small room. So anyway, these are your choices, read by a non-gourmet. Barbecue chicken salad with an Italian club sandwich. California Cobb salad with pesto chicken sandwich. Mango berry salad with a veggie chicken sandwich. Nuts about berry salad with a turkey cranberries sandwich. Harvest salad with a honey baked club sandwich. Nuts about berries salad with a turkey avocado club sandwich. Chipotle glazed chicken salad with ham and smoked cheese sandwich, or a large strawberry harvest salad, or a large protein Cobb salad. You also have a large nuts about berry salad, which is gluten-free for those who prefer that option. All right, let's eat. We'll be starting at 12:15.